My name is Samantha, and at 28 years old, I thought I understood what betrayal felt like. Growing up as the responsible child who worked two jobs through college while my younger brother, James, had everything handed to him, taught me plenty about unfairness. But nothing could have prepared me for that night when I overheard my father tell my brother, "Don't worry, we'll make your sister pay for everything." Their plan shattered my world, but what they didn't know was that I wouldn't let them take a single penny from me. Before I dive into this heartbreaking story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Hit that like button and subscribe if you've ever felt betrayed by the people who were supposed to protect you the most. I grew up in a middle-class suburban neighborhood in Pennsylvania. My father worked as an accountant at a local firm, and my mother was a sales associate at a department store in the mall. From the outside, we looked like the perfect American family: a modest two-story home, a well-maintained lawn, and annual summer vacations to the beach. But inside those four walls, a very different reality existed. As the firstborn, I was always held to impossibly high standards. My parents expected straight A's, perfect behavior, and mature responsibility from the moment I could follow instructions. When I brought home an A-, my father would ask why it wasn't an A+. When I won second place in the fourth grade science fair, my mother wondered aloud why I couldn't have worked harder for first. Then came James, my brother, 5 years younger than me. From the day my parents brought him home from the hospital, it was clear he would be treated differently. While I had plain white furniture in my room, James got a custom-painted race car bed and walls covered in expensive decals. Where I received practical gifts like clothes and books, James unwrapped the latest video games, toys, and gadgets. "Your brother is still little," my mother would say whenever I questioned the disparity. "Boys need more encouragement," my father would add, as if being a girl somehow made me naturally more resilient to disappointment and neglect. By the time I was 10, I was responsible for washing dishes, helping with laundry, and keeping my room spotless. Meanwhile, James left trails of toys and snack wrappers throughout the house, without consequence. "Just pick up after him," my mother would sigh when I complained. "He's just being a boy." When I turned 12, babysitting duties were added to my list of responsibilities. I became the unpaid caretaker whenever my parents went out for dinner or to visit friends. "You're so mature for your age," they would say, as if it were a compliment rather than an expectation they had forced upon me. The Christmas when I was 14 stands out as particularly painful. I had been asking for a laptop for school for months, researching affordable options and explaining how it would help me with my assignments. On Christmas morning, I unwrapped a secondhand laptop that barely worked. 2 hours later, James tore open a brand new gaming computer that cost 3 times as much as what I had requested. "Your brother needs it for his games," my father explained when he saw my expression. "You know those games help with hand-eye coordination and problem solving. What about my education? What about my needs?" Those questions went unspoken because I already knew the answers. When I turned 16, I got my first job at a local grocery store, working weekends and summer breaks. Not because I wanted to, but because I needed my own money. I watched as James received generous allowances for simply existing, while I had to work 20 hours a week to afford the basics my parents freely provided him. "It builds character," my father would say about my job, patting my shoulder as if he were doing me a favor by forcing me into early adulthood. High school brought even more disparities. When I needed money for a class trip to Washington, D.C., my parents told me to use my savings. 6 months later, they paid for James to attend a 2-week computer camp that cost twice as much as what I had requested. "Your brother needs these opportunities for his future," my mother explained. Apparently, my future wasn't worth the same investment. The pattern continued through every birthday, every holiday, every milestone. James received celebrations and rewards, while I received expectations and responsibilities. My achievements were met with nods and quick acknowledgments. His mediocre accomplishments were celebrated with parties and expensive gifts. What hurt the most wasn't the material difference, though that was significant, but the emotional investment my parents poured into James while leaving me to fend for myself. They attended every one of his soccer games, cheering loudly from the sidelines, but missed my honor society induction because something came up. They framed his participation certificates and middle school art projects, while my academic awards collected dust in a drawer. Through it all, I watched James transform from a spoiled child into an entitled teenager. He expected everything to be done for him, threw tantrums whenever he was told no, and developed a concerning lack of empathy for others. By the time he was 18, he could barely do his own laundry or prepare a simple meal. My parents laughed it off as typical boy behavior and continued to coddle him. Meanwhile, I retreated further into myself, building walls around my heart and focusing on the one thing I could control, my own future. I studied harder than anyone in my class, joined every academic club that would strengthen my applications, and worked those grocery store shifts with determination, saving every dollar I could. "Why do you always have to be so serious?" my mother would ask when I declined invitations to family movie nights because I needed to study. "You'll miss these years when they're gone," my father would comment, when I chose work shifts over family gatherings. They never realized that I had already missed out on the family experience they had so freely given to James. I wasn't their child in the way he was. I was their responsibility, their helper, their backup plan, never their priority. By the time I graduated high school as valedictorian, I had already accepted that my success would always be seen as expected rather than exceptional. As I stood at the podium delivering my speech about perseverance and hard work, I looked out at my family in the audience. My parents were there, of course, but I caught them nudging James to pay attention rather than watching me with pride. That night, as relatives and neighbors congratulated me, I made a silent promise to myself. I would build a life so successful, so undeniably impressive, that even my parents would have to acknowledge my worth. Not because I still craved their approval, but because I needed to prove to myself that I wasn't the afterthought they had made me feel like for 18 years. Little did I know, that decision would eventually lead me to the most painful betrayal of all, and, ultimately, to my freedom. The summer after high school graduation passed in a blur of long grocery store shifts and preparations for college. I had been accepted into a respected state university with a partial academic scholarship that covered about 40% of my tuition. It was an achievement I was proud of, but it still left a significant financial gap to fill. "We need to talk about college," my father said one evening in July, calling me into his home office. My mother sat beside him, her expression carefully neutral. I had always known this conversation was coming. For years, my parents had made vague references to helping with my education. But as I sat across from them that evening, I watched them exchange glances before my father cleared his throat. "We've reviewed our finances," he began, shuffling papers on his desk, "and we've determined that we cannot contribute to your college expenses." The words hit me like a physical blow, though I had half expected them. What came next hurt even more. "We need to save for James's education," my mother added softly. "You know how prestigious those computer science programs are. They cost a fortune." James was still 3 years away from college, yet his education was already taking priority over mine. "I understand." Because what else could I say? Arguing would change nothing. Crying would only give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. Instead, I asked practical questions about financial aid forms and student loans, taking notes as this were a business meeting rather than another parental betrayal. That night, I revised my budget spreadsheet and applied for every additional scholarship I could find. I also submitted applications for 3 more part-time jobs near campus, knowing I'd need to work at least 20 hours a week to afford books, housing, and the portion of tuition my scholarship didn't cover. By September, I had secured 2 jobs, one at the university library, working 15 hours a week, and another at a coffee shop near campus for weekends. Between classes, work, and studying, I averaged about 5 hours of sleep per night that first semester. My tiny dorm room became my sanctuary, the first space that was truly mine. I decorated it minimally with secondhand finds, focusing on creating a peaceful environment for the little time I actually spent there. My roommate, Alyssa, quickly became a friend, often expressing concern about my punishing schedule. "You can't keep this up for 4 years, she warned one night when she found me studying at 3 in the morning after closing the coffee shop. "Watch me," I replied, not looking up from my textbook. The exhaustion was real. They were mornings I could barely drag myself out of bed, and nights I fell asleep with my face pressed against my laptop keyboard. I caught every cold that circulated through the dorms that first winter, my immune system weakened by stress and lack of sleep. But I never missed a class, never turned in an assignment late, never failed an exam, and most importantly, never asked my parents for a single dollar. They called occasionally, but the conversations were brief and mostly centered around James's latest achievements. He had made the varsity soccer team, he'd been selected for an advanced computer science program, he needed a new laptop for school projects. We just bought him the newest MacBook Pro. It cost a small fortune, but your father says it's an investment in his future. I thought about my own ancient laptop, held together with duct tape, but said nothing. During my sophomore year, I declared a major in finance, discovering a genuine passion for the subject beyond its practical career prospects. Numbers made sense to me. Financial models didn't play favorites or change the rules. There was clarity and fairness in the world of finance that I had never experienced in my family life. I excelled in my classes, earning the respect of professors who began to mentor me and recommend me for internship opportunities. The summer after my junior year, I landed a coveted internship at a financial firm in New York City. The position paid enough for me to afford a tiny sublet and save a little, my first taste of the financial independence I craved. That internship changed everything. My performance impressed the senior management enough that they offered me a full-time position upon graduation, with a starting salary that seemed astronomical to someone who had been counting pennies for years. When I called my parents to share the news, their response was predictably underwhelming. "That sounds nice, honey." Oh, before I forget, James got accepted into that computer science summer program at MIT. We're so proud of him. By the time I graduated summa cum laude with my finance degree, I had worked thousands of hours across multiple jobs, taken out the minimum student loans possible, and secured a position that would allow me to repay those loans within 2 years if I lived frugally. At 22, I moved to New York City and began my career in earnest. My tiny studio apartment felt like a luxury compared to the shared dorm rooms and summer sublets I've grown accustomed to. For the first time, I could buy groceries without checking the price of every item and occasionally treat myself to small indulgences, a takeout coffee, a new book. I opened multiple savings accounts, each with a specific goal: emergency fund, student loan repayment, future home down payment. Every paycheck was carefully allocated, with the majority going to savings rather than spending. The habits of frugality I'd formed during college weren't easily broken, even as my income grew. My hard work at the financial firm paid off quickly. I volunteered for challenging projects, worked longer hours than required, and consistently exceeded performance metrics. My first promotion came after 18 months, followed by another a year later. Each step up the corporate ladder brought more responsibility, but also better compensation and benefits. By 26, I had repaid my student loans in full, built a 6-month emergency fund, and begun investing aggressively for retirement. At 27, I had saved enough for a down payment on a small but well-located 1-bedroom condo in Brooklyn. The day I signed those mortgage papers was one of the proudest moments of my life. I finally had a home that was truly mine, purchased with money earned through years of sacrifice and determination. Throughout these years, my relationship with my family remained distant but cordial. I called on birthdays and major holidays. I sent appropriate gifts for Christmas and anniversaries. I visited Pennsylvania once or twice a year for brief, often awkward visits, where conversations revolved around James and his pursuits. James eventually went to college, though not to the prestigious computer science program my parents had once envisioned. After mediocre high school grades, he settled for the same state university I had attended, though with full financial support from my parents. From what I gathered during those stilted family conversations, he changed majors 3 times, took 5 years to graduate with a general business degree, and moved back home afterward, ostensibly to figure out his next steps. At 28, I had built the independent life I'd promised myself as a teenager. I had financial security, career success, a home of my own, and a small but loyal circle of friends who had become my chosen family. I had proven to myself that I could survive and thrive without the support that had been so freely given to my brother. And then came the fateful weekend visit home that would change everything. It was my mother's 55th birthday that brought me back to Pennsylvania that April weekend. Despite our complicated relationship, I had never missed acknowledging her birthday with at least a card and a gift. This year, I decided to make the trip home, partly out of obligation and partly because it had been nearly 8 months since my last visit. I arrived Friday evening with an expensive handbag my mother had been hinting about for months, wrapped elegantly with a card expressing more warmth than I typically felt. My father greeted me with his usual distant politeness, offering a brief side hug before returning to the baseball game on television. "Samantha, you finally made it," my mother said, accepting the gift with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "James has been here since Thursday." Of course he had. James, now 23, still lived at home despite having graduated college the previous year. He emerged from the kitchen with a beer in hand, looking virtually unchanged since my last visit. His designer clothes and new smartwatch suggested he wasn't struggling financially, despite his lack of steady employment. "The corporate drone returns," he said by way of greeting, smirking slightly. "How's life in the big city, sis?" "Busy, but good," I replied neutrally, having learned long ago that sharing details of my success only led to uncomfortable silences or quick changes of subject. Dinner that evening was a familiar exercise, a lengthy discussion of James's life and achievements, meager as they were. He had applied for a few positions at tech companies but was being selective about his options. He had joined a recreational soccer league. He was considering taking a coding boot camp that would really launch his career. "The program costs $12,000, but your father and I think it's a worthwhile investment," my mother mentioned. I nodded and took another bite of lasagna, thinking about how they had balked at contributing even a fraction of that amount to my college education. After dinner, James disappeared to meet friends at a local bar, while I helped my mother clean up the kitchen. We made small talk about her friends, garden club activities, and the neighbor's new renovation project, the kind of superficial conversation shared by acquaintances rather than a mother and daughter. "We'll celebrate properly tomorrow," she said as she wiped down the counters. "I have reservations at Giovanni's for 6 o'clock. Giovanni's was the most expensive restaurant in town, reserved for truly special occasions. I nodded again, knowing I'd be expected to contribute significantly to the bill, despite the fact that my parents had made the reservation. By 10:30 p.m., the house was quiet. My parents had gone to bed, and I was settled in my childhood room, now converted into a generic guest room, stripped of all traces of my adolescence. James hadn't yet returned from his night out. Unable to sleep in the unfamiliar bed, I decided to go downstairs for a glass of water. The house was dark as I quietly made my way down the stairs, careful to avoid the third step that had always creaked. As I approached the kitchen, I heard the front door open and close softly, followed by hushed voices. James had returned, and it seemed my father had gotten up to speak with him. I froze in the hallway, not wanting to interrupt what sounded like a serious conversation. I was about to turn back when I heard my name mentioned. "Samantha doesn't need to know this," my father was saying, his voice low but clear in the quiet house. "This stays between us." I should have walked away then. Some part of me knew that whatever I was about to hear would change everything irrevocably, but I remained frozen in place, hidden in the shadows of the hallway. "How bad is it?" my father asked. James sighed heavily. "About $40,000 now. The online poker sites, the credit cards, it all added up faster than I realized." My breath caught in my throat. $40,000 in debt? How had he managed that while living rent-free with our parents? "Christ, James," my father muttered. "Your mother can't know the full amount. She thinks it's half that." I know," James replied, his voice taking on the wheedling tone I recognized from childhood whenever he wanted to avoid consequences. "I messed up, Dad, but I've learned my lesson, I swear." There was a long pause before my father spoke again. "Listen, don't worry. We'll make your sister pay for everything." The words hit me like a physical blow. I pressed myself against the wall, hardly daring to breathe. "Samantha?" James asked, sounding confused but not opposed. "How?" "She has that fancy job in New York, that condo. She has money," my father continued, "and she owes this family after all we've done for her." All they had done for me. My mind reeled at the audacity of that statement. "We'll tell her we want to start a family business," my father explained, his voice taking on the confident tone he used when laying out a plan. "Something about investing in property or a franchise opportunity, something that sounds legitimate enough for her to want to be part of it." "You think she'll just give us $40,000? James sounded skeptical. "Not give, invest," my father corrected. "We'll have her take out a loan in her name. With her credit score and income, she'll easily qualify. We'll promise her returns, partnership, whatever it takes." I felt physically ill. They were planning to defraud me, to burden me with debt to bail out my brother from his gambling addiction and reckless spending. "What if she asks to see business plans or wants to consult her financial advisors?" James asked. My father chuckled. "You know your sister, always so desperate for family approval. We'll tell her this is her chance to finally be part of something important with the family. That emotional angle will cloud her judgment." I heard footsteps on the stairs, followed by my mother's voice joining the conversation. "What are you two discussing so late?" she asked, her tone suggesting she already knew. "Just talking through the plan for Samantha," my father replied. "Oh," my mother said, her voice dropping. "Has James told you about the additional credit card?" "Yes," my father answered, sounding resigned. 40,000 total." My mother sighed. "Well, Samantha has an obligation to help her brother. Family helps family. She's done well for herself. It's time she contributed back." "Exactly," James agreed, his voice suddenly animated. "She's always going on about her job and her condo. She can afford it." "She'll be here all weekend," my father said. "I'll bring up the business idea tomorrow after dinner. Plant the seed. We can work on her over the next few months, have her sign the loan papers by summer." "She always wants to feel included," James added with a laugh that made my skin crawl. "She'll probably jump at the chance to finally be part of the family business." I had heard enough. Moving as silently as possible, I retreated up the stairs and back to the guest room, closing the door without a sound. I sat on the edge of the bed, my hands trembling, as the full impact of what I had just heard washed over me. My family, the people who should have protected me, were instead plotting to use me, to burden me with debt, to rescue my brother from his self-inflicted financial disaster. They discussed it so casually, so confidently, as if my exploitation was their right. I thought of all the years I had worked multiple jobs, the nights I had gone to bed hungry to save money, the countless sacrifices I had made to build financial security for myself. And now, they planned to take it all away, with one manipulative scheme. In that moment, something inside me broke. The last lingering hope that my family might someday see my worth, might someday treat me with the same care they had always shown James, vanished completely. As I sat in the dark room that no longer held any traces of my childhood, I knew with absolute certainty what I needed to do. I did not sleep that night. How could I, knowing what I now knew? Instead, I sat cross-legged on the guest room bed, my laptop open, methodically working through what needed to be done. My mind felt strangely calm, operating with the clarity that only comes in moments of crisis. The shock and hurt were there, lurking beneath the surface, but I pushed them aside to focus on protecting myself. First, I reviewed my financial situation. My savings were substantial but spread across multiple accounts. My investments were doing well but would incur penalties if liquidated early. My condo had built equity, but accessing it would require refinancing. I needed to ensure everything was secure and inaccessible to my family. Next, I considered the personal aspect. The finality of what I was about to do weighed heavily on me. This would not be a temporary distance or a cooling off period. This would be a fundamental severing of family ties. Was I prepared for that? I thought about my childhood, the countless instances of favoritism, the dismissal of my achievements, the constant expectation that I would fend for myself while James received everything, and I thought about college, working myself to exhaustion while my parents funded James's education without question. And I thought about all the birthdays and holidays when my gifts were practical afterthoughts while James received exactly what he wanted. And now the ultimate betrayal, planning to saddle me with debt to cover his gambling losses and extravagant spending, using my longing for family connection against me. Yes, I was prepared to cut ties. I had already been alone in all the ways that mattered for most of my life. I opened my bag and quietly gathered the few belongings I had brought for the weekend. I repacked my toiletries, folded my clothes, and zipped my suitcase without making a sound. I left my mother's birthday gift on the dresser. Despite everything, I would not take back a gift once given. On a hotel notepad I had brought from my last business trip, I wrote a brief note. Had an emergency at work, had to return to New York immediately. Happy birthday, Mom. No apology, no elaboration. They would assume I had left in the morning, giving me valuable hours before they realized I was gone. Then, I settled in to wait. I needed the house to be deeply asleep before I made my move. At 2:30 in the morning, I finally heard James return from wherever he had gone after his conversation with our parents. His heavy footsteps passed my door, followed by the sound of his bedroom door closing and locking. By 3 a.m., the house was silent, except for my father's distant snoring. I picked up my suitcase, slipped my feet into my shoes, and eased the guest room door open. The hallway was dark, but I knew this house well enough to navigate without light. I crept down the stairs, avoiding the creaky third step, and made my way to the front door. For a moment, I paused in the entryway, looking back at the darkened house that had never truly been a home to me. This would likely be the last time I stood here. The thought brought no sadness, only a sense of long overdue liberation. I slipped out the front door, closing it gently behind me. My rental car was parked in the driveway, and I silently thanked my earlier self for choosing to rent rather than letting my parents pick me up from the airport, as they had offered. The night was cool and clear as I drove away from my childhood home for the final time. I didn't look back in the rearview mirror. I checked into an airport hotel 20 minutes away, choosing a national chain where I could earn points on my credit card. The night clerk barely looked up from his phone as he processed my information and handed me a keycard. By 4 in the morning, I was finally in a clean, anonymous hotel room, ready to execute the next phase of my plan. I opened my laptop and logged into my primary bank account. I transferred most of the balance to a secondary account at a different bank, one my parents didn't know existed, leaving just enough in the primary account to avoid fees. Next, I called the 24-hour customer service line for my credit cards. I reported that I suspected potential fraud attempts might be made in my name and requested additional security measures. For my main card, I requested a complete freeze on new charges until further notice, claiming I had lost my wallet. This would result in a replacement card being sent to my New York address, rendering my current card unusable. I emailed my financial advisor, requesting an urgent video call the following day to review my entire portfolio and increase security on all accounts. I was vague about the reasons, but emphasized the urgency. Then, I composed an email to my boss explaining that I needed to take Monday and possibly Tuesday as emergency personal days. I had ample vacation time saved, and my team could manage my projects for a few days. Finally, I searched for an attorney in New York who specialized in financial security and identity protection. I found a highly rated firm that offered weekend consultations and sent a detailed inquiry through their website. By the time I finished, morning light was filtering through the hotel curtains. I was exhausted, but still too wired to sleep. I ordered room service breakfast and sat by the window, watching the sunrise as I contemplated the new reality I had created overnight. Around 9, my phone began buzzing. First, a text from my mother asking where I had gone, then another, more concerned one, followed by calls from her and then my father. I silenced the notifications without reading or listening to their messages. At 11, I checked out of the hotel and headed to the airport. I had changed my flight to the earliest available one, paying the change fee without hesitation. As I waited at the gate, I finally allowed myself to process what had happened. The hurt was profound, a physical ache in my chest that made it difficult to breathe, not because I had lost something I had, but because I had finally accepted I never truly had it to begin with. My family had never seen me as someone to love and protect, only as a resource to exploit. I boarded my flight to New York with a strange mix of grief and determination. By the time the plane touched down at LaGuardia, I had made peace with my decision. I would protect myself because no one else had. As I unlocked the door to my condo that evening, I felt a deep sense of homecoming. This space, purchased with my own hard-earned money, represented everything I had built for myself, despite my family's lack of support. I dropped my suitcase in the entryway and moved through the familiar rooms, touching furniture and belongings that were truly mine. Then I opened all the windows, letting the cool evening air sweep through the space, symbolically clearing out the last vestiges of my family's toxic influence. Tomorrow would bring practical challenges, meetings with financial advisors and attorneys, security measures to implement, a new life to build. But tonight, in the safety of my own home, I allowed myself to feel the full range of emotions I had been suppressing. I cried for the little girl who had never been enough. I cried for the teenager who had worked herself to exhaustion, trying to earn love that should have been freely given. I cried for the young woman who had achieved remarkable success, only to have her family see it as an opportunity for exploitation. And then, as the tears subsided, I felt something unexpected. Relief. The constant effort of seeking approval from people incapable of giving it had been exhausting. Now that I knew the truth beyond any doubt, I could finally stop trying. That night, I slept more soundly than I had in years, my subconscious recognizing before my waking mind that I had finally freed myself from a lifetime of emotional debt. Sunday morning brought 27 missed calls and 43 text messages from my family. I scrolled through them without reading, then deleted the entire conversation thread. I needed clarity and distance to execute my plan, and their words would only cloud my judgment with emotion. My father had also sent 3 emails, the subject lines growing increasingly urgent. Where are you? Then, family emergency. Then, discussion needed. And finally, call home immediately. I deleted those 2. By noon, I had spoken with my financial advisor, who was alarmed by my situation and immediately recommended additional security measures for all my accounts. We set up verbal passwords, removed my parents as emergency contacts, and discussed the possibility of placing a freeze on my credit to prevent unauthorized loans from being taken out in my name. This is unfortunately more common than you might think, she told me. Family financial exploitation accounts for billions in losses each year. You were right to act quickly. The attorney I had contacted responded to my inquiry and agreed to a video consultation that afternoon. She specialized in cases of family financial abuse and identity theft prevention. For 90 minutes, she outlined a comprehensive strategy to protect my assets and establish legal boundaries with my family. Document everything, she advised. Save any communications where they discuss this business opportunity. Record conversations if it's legal in your state. The more evidence you have of their intentions, the better protected you'll be. She also recommended filing reports with financial institutions and credit bureaus, creating a paper trail that would make it difficult for anyone to open accounts or take loans in my name without extensive verification. By Sunday evening, I had implemented most of her recommendations and felt more secure in my financial position, but I knew the emotional confrontations still lay ahead. Monday morning, I took the personal day I had requested and continued securing my finances. I transferred investment accounts to new institutions, changed all my passwords, and set up 2-factor authentication on everything. I updated my will, removing my parents as beneficiaries, and designating charitable organizations instead. At noon, my brother texted, "Mom is really upset. What the hell is wrong with you?" I didn't respond. By Monday evening, the calls had escalated to include extended family. My Aunt Linda, my father's sister, left a voicemail expressing concern about my sudden disappearance and asking me to call her back. My cousin Michael sent a text asking if I was okay. I responded briefly to him saying I was fine but dealing with a personal matter and would explain later. Tuesday morning, I returned to work, throwing myself into projects that required full concentration. My colleagues noticed my subdued mood, but I deflected questions with vague references to family stress. By the end of the day, I felt almost normal. The familiar routine of work provided a welcome distraction. That evening, I decided it was time to address the situation. I couldn't run forever, and I needed closure to truly move forward. I texted my parents, "I'll call at 8 p.m. Please have James there too." At exactly 8, I initiated a video call from my home office, a space that made me feel composed, professional, and in control. My parents appeared on screen immediately, their faces tight with anger and confusion. James joined a moment later, looking irritated at being included. "Samantha, what on earth is going on?" my mother began. "You left without saying goodbye on my birthday weekend. Do you have any idea how embarrassing that was when our guests arrived Saturday evening?" Of course, her first concern was social embarrassment, not my well-being. "I had an emergency," I said evenly, choosing not to elaborate on the lie I had written in my note. "You could have called," my father said. "We've been worried sick." I looked directly into the camera, my voice steady. "I overheard your conversation with James on Friday night." The silence that followed was confirmation enough. My father's face drained of color. James looked away from the camera. Only my mother seemed confused. "What conversation?" she asked. "The one about James's $40,000 gambling debt. The one where you planned to trick me into taking out a loan to pay it off. The one where you discussed manipulating my desire for family connection to get me to sign the papers." My mother's confusion turned to shock as she looked at my father. Apparently, she hadn't known the full extent of their plan. "We were just discussing options," my father began defensively. "Nothing was decided." "You said, and I quote, 'Don't worry, we'll make your sister pay for everything,'" I countered. "You called me a corporate drone with money to spare. You talked about me like I was an ATM, not your daughter." James finally spoke. "You were eavesdropping on a private conversation. Real mature, sis. Interesting that your concern is my overhearing your plan rather than the fact that you were planning to defraud me." "No one was going to defraud you," my father insisted. "We were going to propose a family business opportunity, something that would benefit everyone." "Stop lying," I said firmly. "I heard everything. I know about the gambling debts, the credit cards, the plan to have me take out a loan in my name. I know you intended to manipulate me by using my desire for family approval against me." My mother began to cry. Whether from genuine distress or manipulation, I couldn't tell. "Families help each other," she said between sobs. "James made some mistakes, but he's still your brother." "When has this family ever helped me?" I asked. "When I needed help with college, you told me to take out loans and get a job. When I needed emotional support, you were too busy cheering for James. When I achieved success despite your lack of support, you saw it as an opportunity to exploit me." My father's expression hardened. "You've always been selfish, Samantha, always thinking about yourself instead of the family." I laughed without humor. "That's rich coming from you. Let me make something perfectly clear. I will never give James a penny. I will never co-sign a loan, invest in a fake family business, or financially entangle myself with any of you in any way." "You ungrateful little—" my father began, but I cut him off. "I've secured all my accounts. I've consulted attorneys. I've documented this conversation. If you attempt to access my finances or use my identity in any way, I will press charges without hesitation." James scoffed. "Always so dramatic." "I'm not being dramatic. I'm protecting myself from the people who should have protected me, but instead saw me as a resource to exploit." "What will people think when they hear how you've abandoned your family? What will we tell everyone?" "Tell them whatever you want. But know that if you spread lies about me, I'll tell the truth about you. All of it. The lifelong favoritism, the financial neglect, and now this attempt to saddle me with debt to cover James's gambling addiction." "You wouldn't dare," my father said. "Try me. I have nothing to lose. You made sure of that by never giving me the family support I deserved." The call descended into chaos then. James cursing, my father threatening, my mother crying louder. I remained calm, watching their reactions with a detachment that surprised even me. "This conversation is over," I said finally. "Do not contact me again unless you're ready to apologize and accept that I will never provide financial assistance to any of you." I ended the call before they could respond.
then sat in silence, processing what had just happened. I had said my piece, I had established boundaries, I had stood up for myself, perhaps for the first time in my life. My phone immediately began buzzing with calls and texts, but I ignored them all. Instead, I opened my laptop and wrote a detailed account of the conversation while it was still fresh in my mind, saving it in the documentation folder my attorney had advised me to maintain. Then I blocked my family's numbers and email addresses, a temporary measure to give me space to breathe without their constant attempts at manipulation. I could always unblock them later if circumstances changed. That night, I slept fitfully, my dreams filled with arguments and accusations. But when I woke the next morning, I felt stronger, more centered. The confrontation had been necessary, a lance to drain a festering wound that had poisoned me for years. I was ready to begin healing. Within days of our confrontation, the fallout began. My father's sister, Aunt Linda, called to say how disappointed she was in my selfish behavior. My mother's brother wanted to know why I was abandoning the family during a difficult time. Cousins I hadn't spoken to in years suddenly had strong opinions about my character and choices. It became clear my parents had wasted no time spreading their version of events. Ungrateful daughter refuses to help brother in need, then cuts off all contact with loving family who gave her everything. At first, I tried to explain my side, but the responses made it clear their minds were already made up. Family loyalty ran deep, and few were willing to consider that the people they'd known for decades could be capable of manipulation. After a week of draining, fruitless conversations, I decided on a different approach.
I drafted a detailed email laying out the facts of my childhood, my self-funded education, and the conversation I had overheard. I didn't embellish or exaggerate. The truth was damning enough. I sent it only to the family members I truly cared about. My grandmother Rose, who had always shown me kindness, my cousin Rachel, who had been something of a friend during childhood summers, and my Uncle David, my mother's younger brother, who had occasionally noticed and commented on the disparity in how my brother and I were treated. I don't expect you to take sides, I wrote in closing. I only ask that you consider there might be more to this story than what you've been told. I've removed myself from a harmful situation, and I hope you can respect that decision, even if you don't fully understand it. The responses surprised me. My grandmother called the next day, her voice trembling with emotion. I always saw how they treated you differently, she admitted. I said something to your mother once, years ago, but she dismissed me. I should have been more persistent. I should have done more to protect you. Rachel replied with a simple message. I believe you. She shared her own observations of family gatherings where James received attention and praise while my achievements were minimized or ignored. Uncle David's response was the most unexpected. He invited me to lunch and over pasta at a quiet restaurant revealed that he had recently cut contact with my mother for similar reasons. Your mother and father have always had a blind spot when it comes to James, he said. I'm not surprised it escalated to this. You did the right thing protecting yourself. These small validations were bright spots of healing in what was otherwise a difficult period of adjustment. While I had been functionally independent from my family for years, the finality of this break brought unexpected waves of grief. Not for what I had lost, but for what I had never truly had. Parents who protected rather than exploited me, who celebrated rather than utilized my success. At work, I threw myself into new projects, volunteering for challenges that demanded intense focus and long hours. My boss noticed my increased dedication and mistook it for ambition rather than distraction. Whatever has lit this fire under you, I'm all for it, he said during our monthly review. Your performance has been exceptional. The praise felt good, a reminder that in my professional life, hard work and integrity were recognized and rewarded in ways they never had been in my family. In my personal life, I made a conscious effort to strengthen relationships with friends who had proven themselves trustworthy and supportive. I had always kept people at a certain distance, a habit formed through years of emotional self-protection.
Now I allowed myself to be more vulnerable, sharing more of my true thoughts and feelings. Lisa, my closest friend since college, had always sensed there was something complicated about my family situation, even though I rarely discussed it. When I finally shared the full story over dinner one night, she nodded. Now I understand why. 3 months after the confrontation, I decided I needed a complete change of environment. My company had an opening in their San Francisco office, and I applied for a transfer. The move would mean a lateral shift rather than a promotion, but the opportunity to build a life in a new city, thousands of miles from my past, was too appealing to ignore. When my transfer was approved, I sold my condo for a modest profit and prepared to relocate to the West Coast. The process of sorting through my belongings, deciding what to keep and what to let go, became a metaphor for the emotional work I was doing. Old mementos from my childhood and family went into a box that I stored rather than displayed. Not discarded completely, but no longer taking up space in my daily life. San Francisco offered a fresh start. I found a bright apartment with a view of the bay, joined a hiking club to explore my new surroundings, and established a routine that prioritized both professional growth and personal well-being. In my new city, I also discovered an unexpected resource, a support group for adults from dysfunctional families. The first meeting was uncomfortable, sitting in a circle with strangers, admitting aloud that the people who should have loved me most had instead seen me as a resource to exploit. But as others shared their stories, I recognized patterns and emotions that mirrored my own. The relief of being truly understood was profound. Week after week, I returned, gradually opening up more about my experiences and listening as others did the same. Through the group, I met Aiden, whose parents had remortgaged their house in his name without his knowledge, and Taylor, whose mother had systematically turned family members against her after she refused to keep funding her mother's extravagant lifestyle. Their stories were different from mine in details, but similar in essence. Families who viewed love as transactional and care as conditional. The hardest part, Taylor said during one session, is accepting that they'll never be the parents you needed them to be, that no matter what you do, how successful you become, how perfectly you behave, they'll never see you clearly or love you properly. Her words resonated deeply. I had spent decades trying to earn the love and approval that should have been freely given, believing that if I just worked harder, achieved more, proved my worth more convincingly, my parents would finally see me the way they saw James. Accepting that this would never happen was both devastating and liberating. Around the 6-month mark of my new life in San Francisco, I received an email from my cousin Michael. "Thought you should know," he wrote. "James filed for bankruptcy last week. Your parents have been telling everyone they had to cash out their retirement accounts to help him." I felt a complex mix of emotions. Vindication that the financial disaster I had narrowly avoided had indeed come to pass. Sadness for my parents, who had enabled James to the point of their own financial ruin, and a small, petty satisfaction that justice had been served. But mostly, I felt grateful. Grateful that I had overheard that conversation, grateful that I had acted quickly to protect myself, grateful that I had found the courage to break free from the toxic family dynamic that had defined so much of my life. 1 year after my move to San Francisco, I was promoted to team leader, managing a small group of financial analysts. My apartment had become a home, filled with plants, art I loved, and furniture chosen for comfort rather than status. I had made real friends, people who valued me for who I was rather than what I could provide. On quiet evenings, I sometimes thought about my family and wondered how they were doing, not with longing or regret, but with the detached curiosity one might feel toward distant acquaintances. They had shaped my early life, for better and worse, but they no longer determined my happiness or defined my future. I had built something precious, a life entirely my own, free from exploitation and emotional manipulation.
It had come at a high cost, but as I watched the sunset over the bay from my window, I knew without doubt that it had been worth it. 3 years passed with remarkable speed. My life in San Francisco developed its own rhythm and richness. I was promoted again, now managing a larger team and handling significant client relationships. My apartment, once a refuge, had become simply home, filled with memories of dinner parties with friends, quiet mornings with coffee and books, and the comfortable routines of a life well lived. I had dated casually, though I approached relationships with caution. The therapist I began seeing shortly after moving helped me recognize how my family experiences had shaped my attachment patterns, my tendency to give too much while expecting too little in return. Gradually, I learned to establish healthier boundaries, to recognize my own worth, and to expect reciprocity in relationships. My volunteer work became an unexpected source of fulfillment. Once a month, I taught financial literacy workshops for young women from disadvantaged backgrounds. Helping them understand money management, credit building, and investing gave me a sense of purpose beyond career success. You explain this stuff like someone who had to learn it the hard way, one participant told me after a session on predatory lending. I did, I replied simply. My contact with family remained minimal. My grandmother called on my birthday and holidays. Rachel and I exchanged occasional texts and met for coffee when I visited the East Coast for business. Uncle David sent Christmas cards with genuine, thoughtful notes inside. As for my parents and James, I heard news only through these limited family connections. My father had taken a second job after their retirement savings were depleted. My mother had sold most of her jewelry and designer handbags. James had moved to Florida after the bankruptcy, supposedly for a fresh start. I felt no pleasure in their struggles, but no responsibility for them either. The boundaries I had established remained firm, a necessary protection for my hard-won peace. Then, on an ordinary Tuesday morning, an email appeared in my personal account that stopped me mid-sip of coffee. From James Wilson, subject, long overdue. The sender was my brother. I had not blocked his new email address when he changed it after moving. For several minutes, I simply stared at the notification, debating whether to delete it unread or satisfy my curiosity. Finally, I clicked. Samantha, I know you probably have no reason or desire to hear from me. I wouldn't blame you for deleting this without reading, but I hope you'll give me 5 minutes of your time. I've been in therapy for the past year, dealing with my gambling addiction and the financial disaster I created. Part of my recovery process is making amends to the people I've harmed. You are at the top of that list. What I tried to do to you was inexcusable. There's no justification for attempting to burden you with my debts or for the years of favoritism that preceded that betrayal. I was spoiled, entitled, and completely oblivious to my own privilege within our family dynamic. Since the bankruptcy, I've had to support myself for the first time. I work 2 jobs now, live in a tiny apartment with roommates, and am slowly rebuilding my credit one payment at a time. In other words, I'm finally living the reality you dealt with your entire life. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't expect a relationship. I simply wanted you to know that I recognize the harm I caused, and I'm genuinely sorry. James. I read the email 3 times, searching for manipulative undertones or hidden agendas. Finding none, I closed my laptop without responding and went to work, turning the message over in my mind throughout the day. That evening, I called my therapist for an emergency session. "What do you want to do?" she asked after I read her the email. "I don't know," I admitted. "Part of me thinks responding in any way reopens a door I closed for good reason." I paused, and the other part wonders if people can truly change. If the brother who was willing to defraud me could become someone capable of genuine remorse. Those are both valid perspectives. There's no right answer here, only what feels right to you, and you don't have to decide immediately. I took her advice and gave myself time to process. For 2 weeks, I sat with the email, discussing it in therapy and with close friends whose judgment I trusted. In the end, I composed a brief reply. James, thank you for your email. I appreciate the apology, and I'm glad to hear you're working on yourself. I need time to consider what, if any, relationship I might want to have with you in the future. Please respect that boundary. Samantha. His response came within hours. I completely understand. Take all the time you need. I'm grateful you responded at all. 3 months later, after further reflection and therapy sessions, I agreed to a video call. The conversation was awkward but surprisingly civil. James looked different. The designer clothes and confident smirk replaced by a simple t-shirt and a more thoughtful expression. He told me about his recovery program, his modest job at a local tech company, and his effort to build financial independence. I shared limited information about my life in San Francisco, my career, and volunteer work. We didn't discuss our parents much, though he mentioned they were still struggling financially and emotionally with the consequences of their choices. They still don't fully understand what they did wrong, he admitted. They see themselves as victims of circumstance rather than creators of their own problems. I nodded, unsurprised. Some people never develop that self-awareness. At the end of the call, we agreed to proceed cautiously. Monthly emails, perhaps another call in a few months. No promises, no expectations. Just a tentative opening to see if something healthier might be possible between us as adults. I didn't know if this cautious reconnection would lead anywhere meaningful, or if James's change was temporary or permanent. But I learned enough about myself to know that I could set boundaries and walk away again if necessary. The greatest lesson from this 3-year journey wasn't just about family betrayal or financial self-protection, though those were important. It was about the power of creating my own definition of family, of surrounding myself with people who valued me for who I was, rather than what I could provide. I had learned that sometimes losing a family that was never truly yours is the only path to finding the peace you deserve. And sometimes protecting yourself financially is the first step towards protecting yourself emotionally. As I ended the video call with James and closed my laptop, I felt neither elation nor dread, just a quiet certainty that whatever happened next, I would be okay. I had protected myself when no one else would. I had built a life worth living on my own terms, and that, in the end, was the greatest victory. Have you ever had to protect yourself from people who should have protected you? How did you find the strength to set boundaries and move forward? Share your experiences in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who might need to hear that it's okay to protect yourself, even from family. Thank you for listening to my journey. Remember, sometimes the family we choose is far more valuable than the family we're born into.